For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. Let's talk about the murder of Kitty Genovese and how almost everything in that statement is wrong. You know Kitty Genovese. Even if you haven't heard of her, Hang on. Well, this is how I started my Stephen King video too, but it's also true for Kitty Genovese, granted in a very different way. If you've heard of the bystander effect, you know about Kitty Genovese, since it's also sometimes referred to as the Kitty Genovese effect, and it was her murder that helped coin the phrase. For those of you who don't know, the bystander effect is basically when a catastrophe happens in front of a large crowd and no one reacts because they all assume one of the other people witnessing the catastrophe will act. And for a long time, it's what the media said happened to Kitty Genovese. They believed that her neighbors stood by and did nothing while she was attacked and killed, but that's wrong. So what actually happened to Kitty Genovese? At approximately 3 a.m. on March 13th, 1964, Kitty Genovese was on her way home from her job as a bar manager. She parked her car, then walked several blocks to her second-story apartment. And during this walk, she was stalked by a man who I won't name, because I don't like naming the bad guy. I think it's a problem that I, and a lot of other people, know who Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy are, but can't name a single one of their victims. This isn't the story of the man who took Kitty Genovese's life. It's her story. Anyway, she was pursued and stabbed on the street just outside her apartment. And this is about where the details get murky. According to reports, she screamed, and even though people heard her, no one acted. And to a small degree, this is true. People heard her screams, but some thought it was a lover's quarrel. Some reports even said that this is when the first police calls were made. But you have to remember, this was 1964. No one called 911 because 911 wouldn't be invented for another 4 years. And it wouldn't be until 1966 that domestic violence was even really acknowledged. It was in 1966 that women in New York, where this crime happened, were able to file for divorce under the grounds of domestic violence if they were able to prove it. And it wasn't until 1987 that New York would pass the Domestic Violence Prevention Act. And it wasn't until 1994 that the Violence Against Women Act was passed federally. All this is to say that a lover's quarrel could have very easily involved a husband physically and severely harming his wife, and the police, if they chose to act at all, would have very little grounds to actually pursue it as a crime. Back then, domestic violence cases weren't even processed through the criminal courts. They were processed through the civil courts. But not everyone thought it was a run-of-the-mill husband beating his wife. We know because one of Genovese's neighbors, Robert Moser, yelled out his window to leave that girl alone. And this temporarily scared off her attacker, who went back to his car and moved it to be out of sight. It was at this time that Genovese stumbled around the back of the apartment building, out of sight of most of the apartment windows and the main road, and made it into the stairwell where she collapsed. She laid in the stairwell for several minutes until her attacker returned. Now, I've heard some speculation that in the initial attack, the knife could have punctured her lung, making getting the air to scream very difficult. But we do know that when the second attack started, she was stabbed in the throat in an effort to silence her. But in spite of her not physically being able to scream, people were already awake and acting. I couldn't find the exact number of police calls that were made that night, but we know that at least 2 were made, one by a retired police officer and the second by Carl Ross. And this is where another famous quote from the story comes into play: "I didn't want to get involved." Genovese collapsed right outside of Ross's apartment, and when he heard her second attack, he opened his door, saw the attack happening, closed his door, then he made a panicked phone call to a friend asking what to do, before he climbed out his window to another apartment where he made the police call. And I think the "I didn't want to get involved" quote takes on a different meaning when you know that Carl Ross, like Kitty Genovese, was gay. The line from the New York Times article, "Law-abiding citizens," was false. I mean, point in case, the most famous picture of Kitty Genovese is her mugshot. And this isn't me giving her a hard time in the slightest. She was arrested for bookkeeping for horse betting. That I don't even know if that's a crime anymore. I know I get ads for online gambling sometimes, so I don't know. Who cares? We do know that the other crime Kitty Genovese was committing has since been decriminalized. The horrifying crime of... Okay, hang on. I'm a bad member of the community without a flag, and I don't know if my shirt's gonna show up in this video. I got a cat pin. That's what I have. Anyway, Kitty Genovese and the horrifying crime of homosexuality, which wouldn't be decriminalized in New York until the 1980s. And when investigators came to do questioning the next morning, Carl Ross, who was also gay, I think I already said that, was arrested, and the investigators immediately looked to Mary Ann Zylonko, Genovese's girlfriend, as the murder suspect. It wouldn't be until almost a week later, when Genovese's attacker was arrested for robbery, that he would confess to her murder as well as the murder of 2 other women. But back to the night of the murder. Kitty gets stabbed again when she's in the stairwell, sexually assaulted and robbed, and then her murderer flees. And while this is happening, another neighbor calls the house of Sophia Farrar, who rushes out of her apartment, not yet knowing that the murderer has fled, and went to the stairwell where Genovese was still laying. She held Genovese until the ambulance arrived, and Genovese died in transit. 38 people did not stand idly by while Kitty Genovese was killed. For one thing, 38 isn't even the right number. I found different numbers in different articles, which makes sense because there was no hard evidence to back up the 38 witness number. I've heard some people say that that's the number of windows the building had, that's the number of people questioned, that's the number of police reports filled out. 38 came from many places, but we do know that many of the people who were awoken by the attack acted. They did call the police. They did try to help Genovese. They were not bystanders. While I was researching Kitty Genovese, I found an article from the American Psychology Association, which I'll link down below because it's a great article that talks about the bystander effect and what it really is. To a degree, the bystander effect is real, and larger crowds do react slower, but they do still react. They do not stand idle in the face of real emergencies. And the fact that the myth of bystander effect, the Kitty Genovese effect, has been so perpetuated is another tragedy for Kitty Genovese. When I googled Kitty Genovese, it was so easy to find articles about her murder, about the mismatched facts about her killer. What was a lot harder to find was who she actually was, not just the cardboard cutout of a person who made a good headline. So who was Kitty Genovese? Catherine Susan Genovese was born in New York City on July 7, 1935. She was born to Vincent and Rachel Genovese and was the oldest of 5 children, with 3 brothers and a sister. And after her death, her siblings dedicated themselves to helping people. She was born into an Italian-American family and raised in an Italian and Irish community, where she attended Prospect Heights and was elected the class cut-up. She graduated in 1953, and shortly after, her parents and younger siblings moved to New Cana, I might be mispronouncing that, Connecticut, but Kitty decided to stay in New York. For a while, she worked as a secretary, a job she didn't particularly enjoy, and was fired when she was arrested for her bookkeeping in 1961. Regardless, people say that she was a hard worker and worked her way up from a bartender at the Ev's 11th Hour bar and became the manager. I found one quote of hers where she told her father, "No man could support me because I make more than a man." And this leads into the fact that Kitty wasn't out as gay while she was alive. Mary Ann Zylonko said in an interview, "Being a gay woman in that society was very hard. So we were in the closet a lot. In fact, her family didn't know. I mean, they know now, but there was denial there. It was very hard then." Regardless, it seemed like Kitty Genovese was enjoying her life. People described her as a chatterbox, and she dreamed of someday opening an Italian restaurant. Then in 1963, Kitty met Mary Ann, who passed away in April of 2024, at a lesbian bar. The 2 of them moved in together soon after to what at the time was thought to be a safe neighborhood. It was a quiet, predominantly white, middle-class neighborhood. But the 2 of them lived together for less than a year before Kitty's death. Regardless, Kitty's memory lives on. Another quote I found from Marianne described Kitty as the most wonderful person I've ever met. And that's why I made this video, because Kitty Genovese should be remembered as more than a victim, as more than the Kitty Genovese bystander effect, but as the wonderful person, the bartender, the big sister, the woman with her own hopes and dreams, who is a lot more than the mugshot and the headline.